Reinhard Heydrich was head of the SS secret police, the Gestapo. He was the quintessential Nazi.
War einer der besten Nationalsozialisten, einer der stärksten Verteidiger des deutschen Reichsgedankens, einer der größten Gegner aller Feinde dieses Reiches.
He was the prototype of what Hitler had wished for. He was inhumanity personified.
As Hitler's totalitarian police chief, Heydrich coordinated the persecution of the enemies of the Nazi state, culminating in the Holocaust. He was feared and hated by millions.
You can't just order the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. No normal person would ever dream of creating an industrial killing machine, as he did.
Hitler prized Heydrich for his cold-blooded devotion to Nazism and the Third Reich. As Gestapo chief, Heydrich answered only to SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Together, they carried out Hitler's dream of the so-called final solution. Heydrich was one of the most powerful men in the Nazi Empire. Yet this enforcer of Nazi tyranny was also an ardent music lover.
Whenever Heydrich unpacked his violin and took it in his hands, his face lit up. And whilst otherwise he had a very severe and hard look about him, then his face and eyes would suddenly adopt a warm expression. He was a completely different person. There were two souls in one breast.
This is the story of Heydrich's rule of terror. It would lead him to become the highest-ranking SS man, to be successfully targeted by Allied intelligence forces. Reinhard Heydrich was born in 1904. His father was a composer whose works included an operatic prelude ominously called Reinhardt's Crime. At school, Heydrich was bright and hard-working. From his early years, he loved playing the violin. As an adult, he was a devoted father. Yet this family man who enjoyed many cultivated pleasures rose swiftly through the ranks of the Nazi hierarchy.
He had total power. He had the whole executive in his hand, the criminal police, the security service, the Reich security headquarters, and also the Gestapo. He held power over life and death.
The contrast between Heydrich's private and public lives was extreme.
No one had ever come across someone like Heydrich before. He was the embodiment of the extermination mechanism.
Heydrich's cold, hyper-competitive character fitted well with Nazi principles. A champion fencer, he loved the cut and thrust of combat. Whatever the sport, Heydrich was known as a bad loser. He seems to have been driven by a deep need to prove his worth to himself and to those around him. As a Nazi, he saw life as a power struggle in which the strongest and best forced their way to the top. Those he considered racially inferior, non-Aryans for example, were destined for destruction. Even in his teens, Heydrich had flirted with the right-wing racial theories of the Freikorps, and in appearance he was an ideal candidate for the Aryan SS.
In contrast to all the other Nazi bigwigs, Heydrich was what you could call a genuine Aryan. He was tall with blonde hair, a real giant. He was the ideal representation of the Aryan being.
But in his early 20s, Heydrich showed little interest in Hitler and his fledgling Nazi party. He was dedicated to his career in naval intelligence. But his world fell apart in June 1931 when the Navy dismissed him for conduct unbecoming. He'd promised to marry one woman, but got engaged to another.
Heydrich always suffered from having to leave the Navy. He never got over it, and that bitterness affected him deeply. Lots of people who knew him said that he would never have assumed this role if he'd stayed in the Navy.
Within months, Heydrich started his meteoric rise through the SS. He would soon become Himmler's second-in-command, using his ruthless efficiency to build the Nazi terror state. After his dismissal from the Navy, the jobless Heydrich had been interviewed by Himmler at his chicken farm. Heydrich dazzled Himmler with his plans for the SS counter-espionage. Socialists, communists, Jews and gypsies were hounded by Heydrich's secret state police, the Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo.
The truth was that the Gestapo was everywhere, from this time on, until liberation, in fact. It was the synonym for the Third Reich. It was the code word for Hitler's Germany, for Nazi Germany, and for terror.
As the Gestapo's chief from 1934, Heydrich made it an instrument of terror. At its peak, it had 45,000 staff, but it fed off a huge network of spies and informers. Propaganda films encouraged citizens to report to the Gestapo the slightest expression of disloyalty to the Reich.
Behandelt den Schwätzer so, wie es verdient, als gemeinen Verbrecher. Denn gefährdet das Höchste, dem wir alle dienen. Unser deutsches Volk. Parole, Mund halten.
Das war ja auch charakteristisch für ein solches. That was typical of such a system. A system which always appealed to the evil in people. It meant tarnishing your neighbor's name. When you read the files, you see how it was like something out of the Middle Ages, like the Inquisition. Neighbors could battle out personal feuds by denouncing one another, and that was enough to cause serious difficulties between them, if not a lot worse.
Ralph Giordano lived in Hamburg and was arrested 6 times by the Gestapo because of his Jewish ancestry. Interrogations often lasted several days and nights. Among the many socialists interrogated was Emil Brunner from Dortmund.
One after another was called down from the cell. It often took place at night, and nighttime interrogation was associated with beating, fights, and all sorts of torture. That all happened mostly during the night, so that the neighbors in the area would not hear too much of what was happening to these people. There was a prisoner next to me who had gone down to the cellar. Half an hour later, he came back up, blood pouring from all over his face. They had beaten him up for so long, blood was coming out of every pore of his skin. Then he told me what he'd confessed. He'd received 2 illegal leaflets. He said, all I did was receive them, but they still beat me half to death.
Hermann Lauschbein was arrested in Düsseldorf in 1933 for distributing anti-Nazi broadsheets.
I was led into the cellar, and under the cellar was yet another cellar. When I finally got there, I thought, no one can hear you here. You can scream as much as you want down here, so it's probably going to happen. Yes, now it's going to start. And then they started. So now you're going to confess. One of them sat on the table, a rough kind of table in the corner. And the other one started to get angry. Then 2 SS men came down into the cellar with riding whips and started to strike me. They tore off my jacket, but first I had to lie down on the bench so that they could thrash me better. I thought, you have to endure it. You have to hold out, because you can't give anyone away. They'll grow tired, I thought. They did indeed grow tired. But then 2 others came down, and it started all over again.
Laubsien was imprisoned by the Gestapo for weeks.
I don't know how long anyone can take that. My back was raw, and every additional blow on that sore spot is torture. It's no longer a beating, it's torture.
Many were killed in their cells. In Cologne, prisoners left traces of their desperation, scratched onto the cold walls.
Hours pass like years. The room only knows sighs. Laughter fades to sorrow, and the sun no longer shines. When will this agony come to an end? I am here, and I don't know why.
As a thoroughly committed Nazi, Heydrich persecuted all enemies of the state with ruthless vigor. The German Jews were top of his list of undesirable citizens. He's on record as saying that all Jews were intolerable to his soul. In the 1930s, he favored their expulsion, so-called emigration to Palestine. He claimed to be a Zionist, encouraged support among young German Jews eager to create Israel.
Lots of us wanted to emigrate, especially the young ones. We believed it was best to get out as quickly as possible. The older generations, the parents and older relatives, wanted to stay. They said, "This is our homeland. This is our fatherland. I fought for our German fatherland, my child," my father said excitedly. "We are staying here." And so a great proportion had no intention of getting out. They didn't even think about it.
In March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria as part of the Third Reich. Heydrich grabbed the chance to test out his policy of mass expulsion of the Jews. He had emigration centers set up so that Austrian Jews fleeing persecution could get their emigration papers processed with maximum speed and efficiency. Heydrich's henchman in Vienna was SS man Adolf Eichmann. He too had many helpers.
At the time I said to Eichmann, make an emigration center that has a long table with seats for all the representatives of the travel agencies, of the tax office, of the consulate and so forth. He took that up with enthusiasm. I wasn't exactly proud of it, but though they aren't really appreciated today, these emigration centers were effective. And then the process went very quickly, you see. And he did the same later in Prague and also in Berlin, and they all got out a lot faster.
Within 18 months, 150,000 Austrian Jews had been driven out of their homes, stunning proof to all concerned that Heydrich's policy could work.
Eichmann acted with the same fanaticism as everyone else. I, Eichmann, will show you what the Führer wants. We will make Europe free of Jews. They shall all emigrate.
Heydrich, as head of the Gestapo, was doing exactly what the Führer wished. In fact, Heydrich was even outshining his boss, Himmler. SS comrades joked, Himmler's brain is called Heydrich.
Himmler had to be pushed to do what Heydrich wanted in the end, to achieve his goal, the purging of the party, cleansing the party of its enemies.
Heydrich also sought to eliminate all the Nazis' opponents within the church. He soon had a network of informers within the Catholic Church in Vienna, spying on nuns. Helena Kafka was known simply as Sister Restituta.
I cannot understand how they could kill such a person, so atrocious. Terrible.
Sister Restituta was devoted to her job as a nurse in the operating room at a Viennese hospital. She was strong-willed and resented any attempts to muzzle her religious freedom.
She had been ordered, and she had refused to take down the crosses. That was something of a bone of contention. She said, "I will happily put a cross up, but I certainly will not take one down."
When Sister Restituta disseminated the words of a soldier's song criticizing the Nazis, a doctor denounced her. Her file has been preserved in the Vienna Gestapo Index. She was accused of perfidy and preparing for high treason. Those who knew her still find it hard to believe.
We were all horrified, of course. Above all, we didn't know how it would all turn out. We hoped she'd just be locked up for 3 weeks, maybe even 3 months, and then she'd come back, until we realized it wasn't that easy.
The Gestapo commanded her to leave the order. The sisters submitted petitions of mercy.
We always prayed, always. And she always hoped as well, I believe. I don't believe that she expected to be killed.
But Sister Restituta was condemned to death and executed. Passing sentence, the court described her as a serious threat to the security of the Reich. The Pope beatified her in 1998. Heydrich's Gestapo penetrated every layer of German society. They even kept files on the Nazi leaders. They also turned the private lives of ordinary citizens into Gestapo business, as August Landmesser was to find out. In 1937, he was arrested by the Gestapo for having sexual relations with a Jewish woman.
It was particularly bad when my mother became pregnant the second time. Before I was even born, my father was taken into detention for the crime of racial disgrace.
In 1938, August Landmesser was imprisoned for 2.5 years. The Nazi race laws forbade him to marry Irma Eckler, the mother of both his children.
She was taken away when I was 11 months old. The Gestapo arrested her and sent her off to a concentration camp.
Only one family photo survives. Irma died in 1942 in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Conscripted into the German army, August Landmesser was sent to fight in Yugoslavia.
I continued to wait for him. I went to the Damter station in Hamburg. There's a railway bridge there, and I often stood there watching the trains coming in. They were the trains bringing back homecoming soldiers.
But Irena's father never did come back. She grew up as an orphan. All Irena has left of her parents is a few photographs.
I would have had a caring mother and a caring father.
While the SS carried out his orders, Heydrich found time to enjoy frequent holidays with his wife Lina and their children.
What applied to Heydrich applied to others too. He was like Himmler, like Hearst, the commander at the Auschwitz concentration camp. They were caring fathers. People close to them didn't see the cruelty and inhumanity in them.
Utterly convinced that he was in the right, Heydrich was undisturbed by guilt or pity. He maintained his happy family life as he unleashed his relentless campaign of terror across Europe. Gestapo Chief Reinhard Heydrich and his wife Lena had 4 happy, healthy children. They often spent summer holidays on the island of Fehmarn. Heydrich used to fly himself there direct from Berlin. He'd work on state papers while his children played around him. But on the 1st of September 1939, he wrote his wife an unexpected farewell letter, invoking the values of the SS.
Bring up our children to believe in Germany's Führer, to be ruthless in obeying the basic laws of the SS, ruthlessly disciplined, kind-hearted to their own people, and merciless towards all enemies, at home and abroad.
War had come to Europe. Heydrich, in spite of his high rank, was determined to see action. He served as a rear gunner in Luftwaffe attacks on Lublin, Poland. If you constantly decide over life and death, he said, you must look death in the eyes yourself.
He had no experience of the front, none at all. That was probably the decisive factor in him wanting to go. He wanted to be part of the action and would do anything to get there.
Back from Poland, he soon became even more powerful. In 1939, he was put in charge of the newly created Reich Security Headquarters, which consolidated the SS grip on policing and security. Wielding these new powers, Heydrich had police reserves mobilized for mass murder in Poland. Police Reserve Battalion 102 from Hamburg was among the units under SS control. Its men shot as many as 200 Polish prisoners a day. They were carrying out Heydrich's order to render harmless the entire top-ranking population of Poland. Poland was the prelude to a new dimension of murder. With the outbreak of war, Heydrich couldn't continue the Nazi policy of expelling Jews. The Soviet Union was to be the testing ground for his new approach to the so-called Jewish question. In May 1941, in the Saxon castle of Prech, Heydrich informed top-ranking SS officers of a sinister new mission. Men like Otto Ohlendorf were to lead SS death squads to liquidate the Jews of the Soviet Union. Heydrich warned him the mass murder would be a tough job. Within a month, 4 Einsatzgruppen, or task forces, were ready. Under Heydrich's overall command, they included members of the Gestapo, the secret police, the Waffen-SS, and other police officers.
We were always told we would be sent to the front if it was necessary. We were told that we would be securing areas behind the lines, for example against partisans, ferreting out soldiers of the Red Army who had lost contact with their units, and so on.
Heydrich and his SS top brass knew differently. He cold-bloodedly advised his commanders, be ruthless where you have to be ruthless.
For me and for my fellow soldiers, it was an enormous turning point in our attitude. We found it so difficult to comprehend. Until then, we had thought that such mass extermination was only ever perpetrated by the communists. And now it was suddenly the cultured German nation that was practicing it.
In July 1941, in the sand dunes of Libau in Latvia, the true purpose of the Einsatzgruppen was revealed.
There were a couple of hundred of us, and suddenly the order was given. All men out. My father began to cry. He kissed me, gave me his wristwatch. He knew it was the end.
All men fit for military service were rounded up.
I saw how they were killed. I was only 150 meters away from the spot. We had a forest track. That's where we kept our vehicle, you see. and from there we could see everything.
By the end of 1941, the 3,000 men from Heydrich's Einsatzgruppen had personally shot 300,000 to 400,000 Jews. They included Fanny Segal's father.
I took his coat and went to the prison. There was a policeman there. I said, "Look, my father was brought here yesterday. Do me a favor and give my father his coat. His name is Merkowitz." He said, "Little girl, when was your father taken?" I said, "Yesterday at around 5 o'clock." He said, "Girl, go home. Your father doesn't need his coat anymore."
In Berlin, the public were being entertained by some of the murderer's colleagues. At least 2 people in the audience knew just what was happening in the East. Like his boss, Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich kept himself fully informed of the killings and was plotting the next response to the so-called Jewish problem. When fighting intensified on the Russian front in summer 1941, Heydrich took to the skies once more. Shot down, he was missing for 2 days, but survived. Hitler and Himmler banned him from flying in combat ever again.
He was ordered not to fly because they needed him. They didn't want him to be killed in a crash or to fall into enemy hands if his plane was shot down. That would have left no one at the helm.
With his unrivaled expertise in organizing mass murder, Heydrich was the man Hitler had chosen to complete the extermination of the Jews. Heydrich was to organize the deportation of all European Jewry to the death camps in the East, a task he undertook with relish. In January 1942, he chaired a top-secret meeting in a villa on the Wannsee Lake. He'd summoned senior Nazis there to discuss the so-called final solution. The group openly discussed mass murder. Heydrich announced that it was time to annihilate all of Europe's Jews. As part of the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, he told them, around 11 million Jews come into the equation.
Heydrich was a prototype, an example of a generation defined by absolutes. And by that I mean there are no longer any humane limits. Nothing is impossible. Millions of human beings can be killed.
Heydrich prided himself on having the inner strength to do the unthinkable. Only I can do it, he said. The others cannot. Faced with innocent victims, Heydrich spoke of the duty to be ruthless. He expected his men to be unflinching in their duty.
An enemy of the Nazi Party, an opponent of its ideology, needs to be eliminated. That was it. And in the view of the party, this was a difficult task, but a good deed.
In September 1941, Hitler appointed Heydrich Deputy Reich Protector in charge of Bohemia and Moravia in former Czechoslovakia. His task was to crush all Czech resistance. By the manner of his arrival, he intended to show that the SS were now the masters of Prague.
His entrance was really a stage entrance, as if a big star was coming on stage with drums and trumpets.
There is a lot of good to be done here, he announced, and promptly ordered 400 executions. Heydrich was dubbed the Hangman of Prague by the Czechs.
Although the word deputy didn't really sound all that impressive, you had the feeling that Hitler's extended hand suddenly appeared over Bohemia.
Heydrich wanted his protectorate to be a model for all Nazi-occupied territories. From Prague Castle, he ruled like a new king. He intended to integrate Bohemia and Moravia into Hitler's Reich. The Czechs would be assimilated. Everyone else would be deported to the east by the SS.
Heydrich's major policy, as you know very well, was complete Germanization of the Czech populations. In other words, it would be another German state.
Lena Heydrich was intoxicated by the power her husband enjoyed.
I am swayed by sublime feelings. I am no longer a human being. I am a princess and live in a fairy tale land.
Heydrich set up Theresienstadt, a so-called retirement camp for elderly Czech and German Jews. It became a transit camp for victims of the Holocaust en route to the death factories in the east. Bohemia and Moravia soon felt the full force of SS tyranny. Heydrich's Gestapo inspired fear and terror.
I came there, and there was an officer, and door, and antechamber away, and I saw the man who was completely broken, swollen, full of blood, and so forth. Yeah.
But Heydrich ruled with the carrot as well as the stick. He knew he couldn't afford to alienate all his new subjects.
Naturally, Heydrich wanted to keep the Protectorate quiet, to get as much as possible out of the weapons production. And so we were supposed to serve the front from here. Heydrich could not afford to expel the Czechs straight away. He basically wanted to keep them there until the victory of National Socialism and Fascism.
Heydrich encouraged Czech workers with special rewards, inciting them to make weapons for Hitler's war machine. And on the face of it, this tactic paid off.
At no point were the Czechs on Heydrich's side, but they were happy to let Heydrich buy them. That is something else. They were happy to accept because they had to. They worked in heavy industry. They were actually the armorers for Germany, and they were better paid, better rewarded, and better treated because of it. But that's not to say that they were at all happy about it, or that their feelings changed. That's two completely different things. Opportunism does not mean that you accept the enemy's point of view just because you serve him in order to get something.
Heydrich would call his subjects "my Czechs," seeming to believe he was safe and even popular. Secure in his castle rooms, he could tyrannize his protectorate and oversee the Holocaust in the East. At Prague Cathedral, in the chapel of St. Wenceslas, Heydrich formally accepted the surrender of the keys to the Czech royal treasure. This symbolized the total subjugation of his new kingdom. But Czech resistance wasn't broken, as signs of V for victory over the Nazis showed.
Heydrich did not succeed in breaking our resistance. We continued to fight against the Nazis. Yes, there were many fatalities, but we communists and nationalists in the Czech resistance did not give up. We wanted to defend our land against the Nazis with all our might.
The Czechs did not have long to wait. Heydrich had made himself the #1 target for the resistance. On Hitler's birthday in April 1942, Heydrich was given a train by the Czechs. Often mocked for his high-pitched voice, he was inspired to make one of his rare speeches.
Auch ich bin der Überzeugung, dass damit seitens der Bevölkerung Böhmen und Mährens sinnbildlich jene aufrichtige Gesinnung und Reichstreue zum Ausdruck kommt, die Sie, Herr Staatspräsident, in echter Wenzeltradition verkörpern.
The president, Emil Hacker, was too old and weak to put up any opposition to Heydrich.
We were really prisoners of our own impotence, and I think everyone longed for such a gesture to come. A liberating gesture to show everyone that the Nazis were not as strong as they appeared.
This liberating gesture was advanced by Eduard Beneš, president of the exiled Czech government in London. He used men from the Czech army in exile to execute his plan. Late in 1941, in the Scottish Highlands, Czech and Slovak agents were training for a top-secret mission back in their homeland.
Our job was to train the men right up to the last minute, until the operation, to put the finishing touches to the operation so that the mission would be a success.
That December, a British Halifax took off on Operation Anthropoid. On board were agents Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík. Their mission was to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. But time was running out. Heydrich was on the verge of another big promotion in France, where his job would be to crush the resistance and annihilate the Jews. In May 1942, Heydrich was in Paris surveying what might soon be his new protectorate. To a group of close associates, he spoke again about the final solution. Killing people with exhaust gases was inadequate, he said, because the death toll is too low. As he left, he declared that the death sentence had been pronounced on France's Jews.
Hitler knew exactly who he was sending. The man who could accomplish a task that no one else could do. A task even Hitler himself could not have completed. I believe that Heydrich was a completely split personality. On the one hand, he was musical and educated, and then again, he was this absolutely brutal terrorist who could not stop until he got his hands bloody.
To the east, the death camps were taking shape just as Heydrich planned. Back in Prague, on the 26th of May, the music-loving Nazi ruler attended a concert. The program included his father's operatic prelude, Reinhardt's Crime. He was photographed with Lena for what would be the last time. Next morning, he awoke as usual in the Heydrich family mansion outside Prague. Due to fly to Berlin, he took leave of his wife and children and set off for Prague airport.
I was just mowing the lawn and I saw the family standing in front of the door. Heydrich bent down to his daughter Silke, lifted her up and gave her a kiss. Then he got in the car and drove off.
Heydrich liked to ride in his green open-top Mercedes without an armed escort. The master of life and death felt invulnerable. But his overconfidence brought his downfall. Every morning he took exactly the same route through Prague. It made the assassin's task much easier, even though that day Heydrich was behind schedule. But as usual, the chauffeur slowed here as the car approached the bend where the Czech agents Kubiš and Gabčík were lying in wait. They were armed with a Sten gun and some homemade hand grenades. At 10:29 a.m. they attacked with all they had. Heydrich wasn't killed outright, but he was critically wounded.
One of the guys called me and said there was an attack against a high SS officer in Lebanon. And he was severely wounded. And they didn't dare, I do not know why, to tell me who it was, which was easily for me to guess.
The explosives had torn through the car seat. Bits of upholstery, steel, and fragments of his SS uniform flew into Heydrich's spleen. Himmler rushed in his own doctors, but they could not prevent blood poisoning. The Czechs knew there'd be a heavy price to pay.
Standing there, seeing the car, I saw everything, blood all over Prague.
On the 4th of June, Heydrich died of his injuries. He was only 38.
When we learned about Heydrich's death, we were at first filled with enthusiasm. In our youthful heads, we didn't even think about the consequences.
After executing his killers, the SS blew up the entire village of Lidice. The Gestapo falsely claimed that the villagers had harbored the assassins. 172 men and boys from Lidice were shot. The surviving children were taken away with their mothers, but more was to follow.
Then came the most terrifying moment for us that could ever be imagined, not only for the mothers, but also for the children. Each mother had to give up the most precious thing they had, their child.
The women were deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Few survived. Lidice was leveled to the ground. Its name was removed from all maps.
For us children, it was the worst thing that could possibly happen. We lost everything that we had, our homes and our parents.
Heydrich was given an elaborate state funeral in Berlin. The assassination of such a high-ranking SS man had shocked the Nazi elite to the core. Hitler compared Heydrich's death to a lost battle. Himmler praised Heydrich with a dark reference to the final solution.
Alle Maßnahmen und Handlungen, die traf, packte als Nationalsozialist und SS-Mann an. Aus den tiefen Gründen seines Herzens und seines Blutes heraus hat die Weltanschauung Adolf Hitlers erfüllt, verstanden und verwirklicht.
The violent death, thank God is all I can say, of Heydrich had no bearing on the course of the final solution. You can't say that with Heydrich's death it got better, if you can use that word at all in this context. That's something you must always remember. The extermination process, like the rule of the secret police, only came to an end because Germany lost the war.
Heydrich's death did not stop the next phase of mass murder he had planned for the SS. In Operation Reinhard, named after Heydrich, 2 million Polish Jews were exterminated in the death camps. But Heydrich's plans did not end with the extermination of Europe's Jews. He had also proposed the murder of many millions of Slavs as the final phase of his so-called racial purification of Europe.
The plans were in place. If Germany had defeated the Soviet Union, around 90 million Slavs would have been under the control of the Nazis. Of these, 14 million would have been needed as working slaves. Around 30 million were going to be killed. The rest were to be sent over the Ural Mountains into the wilderness of Siberia. All that is personified in Reinhard Heydrich. I am utterly convinced that he would never have hesitated for 1 second, not a single second, to make these unthinkable plans a reality.
To his family, Reinhard Heydrich was a caring father and loving husband. But he will go down in history as the man who masterminded the murder of millions, without any remorse. His father's work, Reinhardt's crime, had been aptly named.